3/4 from Heaven, Part 3, Chapter 12, Ready for a New Life. The creature pounced on me and made tatters of my shirt in one smooth thrust of his hand. I catapulted into the kitchen counter, making the toaster and the blender compact. Joe was flung through the kitchen doorway and out into the living room. The thing jumped up onto the counter with great agility and picked me up clumsily by the neck. I was soon face to face with the creature, its stench-ridden breath looming over me like a dark cloud. My shaking hand patted at the counter, searching for anything at all. The creature's lips pulled apart, revealing its diseased, dank mouth. The tongue lolled out at me, blood dripping off. My hand caught a knife, which must have been dislodged when I crushed the kitchen knife block. I slashed it upward in a fast-paced blur, which ended in a spray of red blood. The creature screeched as its entire head fell back from the neck. I was released as it collapsed off the counter and onto the hardwood floor. I fell back against the cabinet behind me, breathing hard, knife held to my side. Then, just as I was about to check on Joe, Georges toppled out of the now closing portal. His hour was up as well. He was smiling when he looked up at me, and then frowned when he actually saw my sorry state and the dead beast lying at my feet. "What the hell?" Georges muttered, drawing back from the corpse. I tried to answer, but my chest ached too much from the blow I had received. Joe fumbled out of the living room, mud and blood pasted to his grizzled face and tattered attire. He collapsed in George's arms, his body going limp. Georges set him into a chair, and he looked shockingly up at me. His eyes ran up and down my beaten body, from my muddy jeans to my bare chest to my cut and bruised face. "What? Where did this come from?" Georges stepped over the thing's severed head. "Give me some ice," I said. I had explained the story to Georges as Joe and him sat at the table. Joe had tissue under his nose and an ice pack to his temple. I had an ice pack on my own head, a towel thrown over my shoulders. We had both washed off our muddy clothes so that Joe and I could put on George's clean clothes. "Good Lord," Georges replied, extracting a mop from the closet. He started to mop up the blood around the now stinking body. "At the library, it never said there was an execution chamber in the Law's Door Castle. I thought it was just for the police station." "No," I snapped. "This was a home for that monster. This must be some kind of secret chamber the king uses to get rid of useless beings." "Murder? There must be a logical explanation." "So, how did your meeting go anyway?" Joe asked, breaking the silence. Georges smiled again and sat down next to me at the kitchen table. "Oh, I showed him the pictures of our world, mostly postcards of France, New York City, Hawaii, you know," he explained. "He was completely interested. I showed him samples of our technology like a calculator and a digital camera for your pocket. Anyway, he thought we could switch positions on our thrones because he seemed to love Earth and—" "Wait a minute. He thinks you're the king of our world?" I asked. "Well, yeah. How else would we agree on switching positions unless someone who actually owned the place made the offer?" Georges said. "But what happens when he gets to Earth and finds you weren't the owner?" "He'll be furious," I explained. "He'll come back to you and kill us." "Not if we have the stones," Georges said. "There'll be no portal for him to come back in." "But the stones are here," I said tiredly. "How are we going to bring the stones to the Shadow Earth with us?" "Exactly," Georges cried. "When you first get sucked into the portal, up above your head you can see the 3 stones faintly glowing behind the strong ceiling of the portal. If we could somehow grab onto them, we could bring them back with us to our new world," Georges finished. I shuddered at the thought of our world. That world was truly evil and dangerous. Why couldn't he see this? I knew Joe did because he was shuddering too, his nose tissue starting to turn red again. "I know I'm tricking the king into this, but once we're ruling our own world, it will be well worth it," Georges assured us. "Georges, don't you see how dangerous this is? How do you know those shadow humans won't do what I've observed so far?" I asked, and Joe nodded in agreement. "Don't you see, guys? If we're kings, they'll have to obey and respect us," Georges said with enthusiasm. "I've read that even if the king isn't liked, he still should be obeyed. Once the king signs us over, I considered, and a part of me thought this plan was actually going to work. Sure, the king would be lost in a world that could crush him like a bug, but at least we'd get something out of it. But could I actually give up my home and my family for this new world? But being king would make these horrible creatures bow down before me. I'd get used to it, and in the end, it would be better than my position here." Oh, what the hell, Joe blurted out. Jim, let's do this. But Georges, there's one thing you haven't thought about, I added. Sure, they can't come back with the stones, but they'll come back after their hour's up. Oh, but I did think of that, and I'll destroy the stones, Georges said. But I've already tried to do that with a hammer. How? Georges and Joe looked over at me bewildered. I stopped and gave an awkward smile. We'll use my sledgehammer then, Georges interrupted, giving me a suspicious glance. After that, we're stuck there for good, so you can't turn back. Are you two in? Georges gave me a pleading stare, but inside his eyes were something else. It was madness, sheer insanity. Inside Georges, he was truly going crazy over this world. I nodded just so that he would unlock his gaze. Joe did as well. So, anyway, the king is interested. He wants us to come back tomorrow with the stones so we can check out our place, okay? Georges asked. Joe nodded, his eyes wide, the shiner under his eyes twitching unnoticed. I did not nod. I just stared at the fresh blood on the kitchen floor. The blue creature's severed head was perched at my sneakers, its green blank eyes fixed on me. Well, if we're moving, I'd better get my fiancée, I said. Joe had already left to pack. I left George's house with my hands full of a trash bag containing pieces of the skeletal creature. I dumped the bag into George's trash can, burying it under all the beer cans. I hopped into my car, and as I pulled out, I looked back over my shoulder. Georges was looking out at me from his attic window, his eyes alight. He had a deep, longing frown painted on his chin. There were black, wrinkled bags hanging from his chilled eyes. He quickly stepped back so he was out of view. Yet I could still feel his icy stare as if he was peeking over the windowsill. I sped away. My former knowledge of Georges gone with the wind. He was insane with power. Could I trust Georges anymore? I knew Joe detected this in our friend as well. He was just as uneasy as I was during lunch. I sped back to Amy's apartment building where she was just getting into her Volkswagen Beetle. She had her beautiful shining hair pulled back. Her cheekbones were rosy and thick with makeup. She was wearing a small halter top and dark jeans. She looked up at my beaten-down Toyota rambling toward the curb. She smiled and slid out of the car majestically. I stumbled out of mine, with my head still bandaged and an uncomfortably tight shirt pasted to my thick chest. Fresh blood was also starting to collect on my slowly healing face. Amy's face turned to shock as she jumped into my arms. What happened to you? Amy, I just bumped into something. Why I'm here, though, is I didn't know how she was about to take this news. How we couldn't get married in front of her families and friends. How we'd be one of the 3 new rulers of an almost misunderstood world. Could she accept this? I still didn't believe what was happening to me. How would she react? I shuddered unmistakably, making Amy draw back, her full pink lips pursed, her chest heaving as she took a deep, lumbering breath. Amy, how would you like to get married someplace else? Someplace wonderful and beyond your wildest dreams? I was sugarcoating it a bit, putting a pleasant mask on a savage monster. Instead, Amy kissed me long and hard, her hips swinging against mine, fingertips scratching across my bruised cheeks. She then looked up at me, her lips parting in pure love. Jim, you're taking me someplace exotic? The Bahamas? Hawaii? We're not going to get married in the church then? Oh, will our families come? Jim, I interrupted her, my fingers pressed upon her pursed lips. I looked down into her eyes, my mouth searching for the right words. Why didn't I just leave her there? The departure would be overwhelming, but at least Amy would be safe. Amy, that suitcase in your car, is that all your bare necessities? Yes, she said, bemused. Take it. We're going to leave today. I'll explain everything soon, I said, jumping into my already running car. Amy just stood there, stunned for a few seconds, her arms folded over her chest. She disappeared into her own car and tinkered around a bit. She came out with her suitcase, her hips swinging with each clumsy step. She threw her suitcase into the back of my Toyota and looked intently into my flushed, beaten face. I could feel Amy's eyes scanning my head. I locked the doors, sealing her fate. I swerved away from Amy's home, knowing she would never see it again. I was leaving everything behind I ever loved. I had a job as a mechanic, and I was a damn good one at that. I had the weekend off, but I had so far missed 2 days of work due to my sudden interest in this horrific, beautiful world. My boss, Andy Lowell, must have tried to call my place many times, but I had hardly been home. You want to tell me what the hell's going on? Amy asked. All will be explained, honey. But for now, don't ask too many questions. It will all go right over your head. Jim, what do you mean? I don't understand any of this. Amy's lip began to quiver. I lost track of time for a moment and snapped out of my daze when I heard Amy scream. I swerved until I smashed into something unmovable. Amy was screaming and clawing on me. and I realized that I had crashed into a garage door. Last time I had blacked out and imagined the shadow world, I had ended up hitting George's mailbox. Now I had blacked out and crashed into his garage door. It was almost as if the car had driven itself here when I couldn't see the road any longer. Almost as if the stones were drawing me to them. Once that world had gotten a taste of me, it kept going back for more. More or less, I believe that. Amy looked over at me and kissed me on my head. Jim, oh God, are you okay? I don't know, I just spaced out, yet it was more than that. I tore away from my fiancée's embrace and fumbled out of my car. I vomited onto the pavement, feeling as if I had just taken a bath in hot oil. Amy threw her arms around me from behind, her hot face pressed into the small of my back. Then, as I spit the leftovers of my sickness into the sidewalk, I realized, just like George's, that I was going insane. Amy and I knocked on George's door, and surprisingly Joe answered, sweaty and just as disarrayed as I was. He pulled us inside and quickly led us into the kitchen. Joe sat down at the usual spot at the kitchen table, and I took a seat too, stretching out my back. Amy shakily said hi to Joe, but dismissed herself into the bathroom. I had an inkling to go after her, but the 3 stones on the table twinkled at me and urged me to stay. The box sat there too, silent. Did you tell her? Joe asked me, folding his arms across the table. About our new life? Not yet, but where's George's? And why are you here? I asked quickly. George's left a note saying he went back to the shadow world. He can't be apart from that place, Joe explained, wiping his brow. The note was on the door, saying you or me could just come in. So, we leave tomorrow then, huh? I said slowly. Joe was feeling the full extent of it too. What do you think of all this? I don't know. Jim, it's all so crazy. Today I woke up and imagined big spearheads sticking out of my stomach. I imagined things too. Didn't you hear me just drive into the garage? I asked. No, I guess I must have blacked out again. These moments of lost time come so frequently, I don't even remember them anymore, Joe explained, massaging his temples, his eyes flicking back and forth to the stones. I have such a longing for those stones. All I want to do is go back to that world and die there. I was getting that feeling too, hot and burning in my chest. The stones seemed to suck me towards them, their paint gleaming and shining. I loved them, even though I had only hated them moments ago. I had visions of embracing their hot white electricity, overwhelming my twisting and burning body. I shook that away just as Joe left the kitchen. Amy came in soon after that, refreshed and looking lovely as usual. She sat down where Joe had once sat and leaned over my way. Her eyes blazed like headlights again, juicy lips pursed in a loving fashion. She had her hair let down now, the way I liked it, her mascara completely rubbed off. So, tell me, Jim, what in God's green earth is going on here? Her hands taking mine. I pulled away from Amy, my face twisted. I just couldn't be around her. It was just so painful to look at her. Just when I was about to reply to Amy, Joe bounded into the kitchen yelling like a savage ape. There was a huge sledgehammer at his side. His eyes were ablaze. Sweat poured off of his chin. I screamed and pounced onto Amy, bringing her to the floor. Joe brought the sledgehammer down onto the table. The stones scattered to each corner of the kitchen. The table split into 2, the legs and chunks of chipped wood spinning out of the wreckage. Yet the sledgehammer kept on going, and it smashed a good-sized divot into the floor. Joe saw what he had done and fell to his knees, sobbing. I rolled off of the stunned Amy and pulled Joe to his feet. He looked up at me with glassy, respectful eyes, but behind that gaze was a look of pure hatred and loathing. He was truly not in the right state of mind for this, and neither was I. I hugged him and let him cry into my shoulder. I patted his back and ruffled up his hair, as we used to do as kids. I also gasped at the sight of the now open box, its lid splintered open by the force of the weapon. It lay there scattered at my feet. Once I saw the once hidden objects that George's had no intention of showing us, I drew in a deep, lung-burning breath, which caused Joe to look at me. I screamed, Joe and Amy jumping high in the air. My eyes rolled back, and I drew short of breath, as Joe too began to scream. Then, until the portal was quickly formed, George's was home. Chapter 13. George's Change. In George's cedar box was a handgun. 5 bullets were scattered around it. There was also a gobbet of meat inside a Ziploc bag. Another bag was there at my feet, only inside it was an ear of a shadow man. A large bite had been taken out of it. There was also a gnawed finger and a chunk of muscle, which had a handful of ice around it. What made me scream as loud as I did was that the same bag of ice contained 2 glazed shadow eyes, the pupils stretched and blurry. Suddenly we noticed the portal was open. Inside we could see George's pin-sized body flailing upwards at us at an alarming speed. I jumped at the objects, and with a sinking stomach, shoved them inside the box and covered them with what was left of the lid. I then slid it across the littered floor until it hit the wall with a thud. George's then sailed out of the rainbow portal and hit the ground in a cloud of splinters and dust. He then clumsily got to his feet, and we all gasped. Georges stood there. At least I thought that was him. His face now was covered in boils. His skin was pale, and we could see his veins running underneath. His eyes were bloodshot and glassy. He was hunched over, and he looked at us with a stony glance. His eyes then widened as he looked at his ruined kitchen. "What the slunder happened here?" he croaked, his eyes still fixed on us. "Oh, George, Joe began, but Georges interrupted him briskly. "It doesn't matter. I'll be out of this dump soon anyway." He looked around and locked gazes with me, his cold eyes slitting. I smiled fakely and pulled the shaking Amy close to me. She had just watched Georges fall out of a rip in space. I would be shaking too. "I got Amy," I said, breaking the silence. "But it's getting late. We'll both go home." George's eyes ran up and down Amy, and I frowned. At this point, I wanted to grab her and Joe and sprint away from that house and all that we had uncovered in the past week. I was going insane, and I was becoming almost hypnotized. How long could I keep this up before I looked like Georges did? Georges snatched up a stone and inspected it. I longed to hold a stone as well, kiss it, embrace it. Georges sensed my love for them and clenched his fist over it. He frowned. I grabbed a stone for myself, almost to meet his challenge. He froze and smiled, but I frowned. Amy stared at both of us, puzzled. "Ready?" Chapter 14. Joe's Breakdown. Today was the day of our new lives. I took off my tattered, bloody clothes and hopped in the shower. I got into George's old clothes and marveled on how much my cuts had healed in the mirror. When I got out of the bathroom, I saw Joe and the fresh but anxious Amy. She immediately started asking questions, but I ignored her for the minute. Georges glanced over at me and grinned. "Hey, you all cleaned up for our big adventure?" Georges said. "Georges, I don't know. This whole fiasco." "Shut up, Joe," Georges snapped. "Jim?" Georges looked over at me questionably. "Georges, I have to agree with Joe," I stuttered. No, no, Georges grabbed a dish off the table and hurled it across the room. "You will not walk out on me now." Georges picked up a stone and held it up to my face. "You are going. No one's leaving." He picked up another and threw it at my shoe. I grabbed his hand and pulled him close. "Georges, stop. Just destroy those stones and be done with it," I screamed. Georges only smiled. "We're not going insane, Jimbo. We're just beginning to understand." "What does that mean?" I yelled, kicking one of the stones away with my shoe. Georges pulled away from me. "Can't you feel it?" It wasn't a question. "Can't you feel the vibrations inside your mind? Can't you feel yourself changing?" He looked at his shadow hands and grinned even wider. I sat down next to the frightened Amy and held her hand. "I'm just so confused," I replied. Georges bent down next to me and Amy. "You don't have to be." Joe looked at us, the third stone held tightly in his fingers. He stared deep into me, searching my soul. He quickly looked away. I nodded and led Amy over to where the stones lay. I knew the world was evil and monstrous, but I didn't care at that point. All my senses were depleted. Like it or not, I was too far into this mystery. But did I want to get the love of my life into this? I looked over into her beautiful face and slowly kissed her, interrupting yet another one of her questions. I broke away from her and looked back into the stones that beckoned me forward. "Now, once we get into the portal, everyone try to grab the 3 stones up above your heads, okay?" I nodded and Joe did too. Amy just looked directly into my eyes. I looked away. Georges smiled and beckoned me to begin the procedure. He dropped one of the stones at my feet, next to the other one. I nudged them both together until a thin spark of black electricity cracked, which made my heart jump. I shot a look towards Joe, who held the last piece of the puzzle. Joe did not waste a minute before dropping the last stone into the pile. Once it struck the other 2, the portal opened like a trapdoor. Joe was closest and stepped inside. Georges followed, grinning back at us. Amy screeched, clawing at my chest before being pulled towards it. She was sucked out of my arms. I was lost, my eyes dazed, my body numb. Sure enough, there were 3 blazing circles hovering above the first corner in the tunnel. The stones! Joe clumsily grabbed for them, his fingers only skimming the portal ceiling. Not even close. Georges was ready, though, and he stuck his hand quickly into the greenish electric wall and howled in pain. Georges disappeared around the corner, still screaming. Amy spun right past the target, her voice distant, her limbs flailing. I slammed my fists into the ceiling of the portal and felt blinding pain slice across my hands. I quickly withdrew them. My thoughts trailed off, and the next thing I knew, I was tumbling shoulder first to the earth. I collided with the dirt, still yelling. The pain was just so overwhelming. Georges grasped my arms and shook me awkwardly. He was also yelling excitedly, and so was Joe. I opened my eyes and saw that Georges held a stone in a charred, scabbed hand. He was smiling wildly, grasping my sore shoulder, but I frowned. "What about the other two, Georges? Why are you so happy?" I muttered breathlessly. Then I looked down at my scorching fingers. I gasped, and then laughed wearily. I held the other two painted rocks in my bleeding hands. We had successfully gotten the stones to the other world. We whooped proudly and gathered together in celebration. However, the portal had still not closed overhead, and Amy had still not surfaced. When I noticed her absence, I looked up at the fading portal. Electricity of all colors reaching down at us. I saw Amy falling toward us, her eyes alive, her body limp. I yelled for her, but she was too distant. The portal closed, but only half of Amy's body was protruding from the electric bolts. She still fell down into my arms, screaming wildly. I screamed too, the stones clattering to the dirt. The portal had closed on Amy's arm, which had still been inside the tunnel, and it had kept her hand. The tunnel had made a clean cut at her wrist. There was no blood. Her wound had been cauterized. Amy passed out in my arms, her blackened stump resting on my shoulder blade. I stared wide-eyed at my two friends, who gave me the same look. My fiancée was injured, robbed of her hand. I sat down with her and cradled her in my arms. "Look what you've done!" I screamed at Georges, as if it was his fault. I set Amy down gently and pounced at Georges. Georges fell back, and I plunged my fist into his face, and he screeched in pain. Joe tried to pull me off, but I stabbed my elbow into his chest. He heaved a hoarse breath before falling backwards. I smacked Georges in the mouth one more time before I felt the tip of his revolver stab into my intestines. I froze, and Georges hissed for me to roll off of him. I did so and sprang to my feet. Georges was up too, the gun aimed right at my chest. "It's loaded, Jim." I backed away, my hands to the sky. "Georges, please." I was upset, I murmured. Without lowering his weapon, he wiped the blood from his nose and lip. He grinned and held the gun out even further. He shook his head and cocked the revolver. I gasped and closed my eyes as he fired. When I was still standing, I looked up at Georges, who had already put the gun away. A large red bird hit the ground some 20 feet away, its chest naked of feathers and bloody. "Great shot, huh?" Georges boasted, laughing at my fear. I sat down with a thud and pulled the unconscious Amy towards me. Joe stood up, his chest heaving. Georges grabbed him and pushed him towards the dwarfed land sky off in the distance. "You know the drill, let's go," Georges screamed. "But Georges, Amy's hurt." Georges slapped Joe savagely across his cheek, which made him pull back. "Go!" He looked over at me and beckoned with his blistered fingers. I gathered Amy in my arms, and we hiked towards the airport. I already missed our old Earth, but I still had my sanity. Every second I was there in the Shadow Earth, it was getting worse. We were sitting in the land sky, each of us holding one of the stones. I cradled Amy in my arms. At this point in time, I just wanted to grab all those stones and steal away, leaving Georges as far away as possible. Joe had his head in his hands. Georges gave me a sharp look, both electrifying and dazed. I began to shake, but I could not look away. Georges smiled wickedly, his swollen lip curling away like an unveiling curtain. I started to moan under my breath. The man at my right cut the awkward silence by pulling me out of my seat and pushing me toward the doorway of the plane. We had arrived at the Lawsdoor Kingdom. I nodded my head and carefully toted my fiancée down the rope coil until I was on the landing pad. Georges came up next to me. Joe was still up in the land sky, and he was hesitating at the entrance. The employees smiled carefully at Joe and made a movement with his hand towards the exit. Joe now was sweating. He shook his head towards the man and scrunched up against the wall. The man grabbed his arm and tried to direct him, but Joe screamed bloody murder and smashed the employee over the head with his knuckle. The man screeched and fell to his knees. Joe punted the man in his ribs. They cracked, and the man tumbled backwards out of the land sky. I saw his body plummeting at us, and I quickly gathered my fiancée and jumped away. The man fell 150 feet and crashed with the earth with a bone-crushing splat. Up ahead, other land sky guards were now attacking Joe and had smashed him up against the wall. Joe moaned in pain as one of the guards slammed his head into the cold metal. Joe reached blindly and caught one of them by the ankle. He knocked that one onto his back and kicked another right in the shin. The men fell away for a second, and Joe crawled to the exit and out of the doorway, his fingers wrapped around the rope. His legs were still in the plane, so one of the men grabbed him by his pant cuff. Another grabbed his other leg. Joe freed one of his hands and pulled another man down to his death. The other became afraid and let go of Joe's cuff, so that Joe fell head first downwards, hanging onto the rope with one hand. I watched Joe as he fell, screaming. In air, Joe grabbed the rope with his other hand, slowing himself considerably, and by the time he stopped, he was only a few feet above us, screaming. Then the land sky started to move, taking Joe with it. I screamed for my friend. Joe swung around in the air, desperately, his head tucked into his coat, his eyes closed tightly. His legs were wrapped around the rope. "Joe, you're not too far from the ground. Let go!" Georgia screamed. Joe nodded and, without looking down, released his grasp and fell to the earth hard, in a plume of dust. We ran to his aid. He was still sobbing, his legs kicking in the dirt. I bent down and slapped him hard, until he immediately halted and stared into my face. "What the hell were you thinking?" I screamed at him. I got back to my feet and turned towards George's, who was once again holding the gun. It was directed toward Joe. "You're dead weight, Joe. I can't keep you on this mission. It's too much for you," Georges said. "No, Georges, you can't do this," I screamed. Joe instantly looked up through his teary eyes, right into the gun's barrel. I pounced on Georges and intercepted the gun with perfect accuracy. I fired a shot into his foot. Georges groaned and stumbled backwards, teetering on the cliff behind him. I could see that it broke off from the platform. I noticed this and pistol-whipped Georges across the face, before pushing him in the chest, my hand coming away with a piece of his shirt. Georges fell backwards off the edge of the cliff, and the last thing I heard was him screaming my name. I collapsed next to Amy and Joe and huffed a sigh of relief. I let the gun roll away from my hand. Joe pulled up next to me and squinted in disbelief. "How are we supposed to get home?" "He got the stone," Joe huffed. I unclenched my other hand to reveal the front pocket of George's shirt, which had contained the stone. By tearing off his pocket, I had taken the stone with it. All 3 rocks were now in my possession. I smiled at Joe, and he smiled back at me. We hugged each other and squeezed each other's shoulders. A thin ray of sunlight was breaking through the black clouds, like thin fingers that grappled with the edge of the cliff.